Reading 2, Guidance for Standards 1 through 7. This reading is common across all three levels. My advice with this particular reading is that you do it from the curriculum. It's a fairly long reading, but those of you who are now at level 2 or level 3 realize that ethics is difficult in the sense that there are so many different scenarios and circumstances which makes this topic quite subjective. And the best way to get a grasp on this material is to read it from the curriculum. You will notice that for each standard, and when I say standard here, I'm actually referring to a substandard. You might recall from the previous reading that standard 1 is professionalism, and then standard 1A is knowledge of the law. So here, when I say standard, I'm referring to a substandard such as knowledge of the law. In the curriculum, for every standard, you will find some guidance which explains that standard in detail. And then for most standards, there are some recommended procedures for compliance. In this particular lecture, I will try to emphasize the main points related to every single standard. Now, in the curriculum, after the guidance and recommended procedures, for each standard, there is a segment called application of the standard. Here you will find several examples related to that particular standard. And those examples are very scenario based. So you will be given a scenario or a situation, and then ideally you should be going through those scenarios and then thinking about whether the standard has been violated or not, and what is the appropriate course of action for the protagonist in that scenario. In fact, I'd recommend that you imagine yourself being the protagonist. And then after thinking about the appropriate course of action and whether the standard has been violated or not, then you should read the comment under each scenario. If you are simply listening to my lecture, then the way you need to work through this is listen to the main points. If you have time, also read from the curriculum, but if you don't have much time, then at the very least, go through the application of the standard section for every single standard. In this particular lecture, I'm not going to explain all the terminology. This is because students at level 2 and 3 will already be familiar with the terminology. And even level 1 candidates who have a finance background will be familiar. But let's say that you are getting started with your level 1 studies and you do not have a finance background, then there will be terms that you might not have heard of. For example, I might refer to an oversubscribed IPO. What I want you to do is, whenever you come across a term that you don't know, look it up. And one of the best places to go is investopedia.com, or you can simply Google the term. And by developing an understanding of the various terms, that not only will help you with ethics, but it will also build your finance general knowledge. And this will support you later as you go through the CFA program. Let us now discuss the standards. So here are the 4 standards associated with professionalism. We've talked about these briefly in the previous reading, and now we will discuss them in detail. So standard 1A, knowledge of the law. Members and candidates, so that's you, must understand and comply with all applicable laws, rules, and regulations of any government, regulatory authority, licensing agency, or professional association governing their professional activities. That for you would be CFA Institute. In the event of conflict, members and candidates must comply with the most strict law, rule, or regulation. Members and candidates must not knowingly participate or assist in and must disassociate from any violation of such laws, rules, or regulations. If you look at this standard carefully, 3 points are being made. The first point is that you must understand and comply with the law. Now, obviously, this is important. In any profession, you need to understand the relevant legal context and you need to then follow the law. And I'll give you a simple example here. Let's say that you are operating in a country where very recently certain laws have been passed about the usage of social media. And let's say that you have been communicating your investment research through Facebook and Twitter, and you are not aware of the recent laws which have been passed with regards to the dissemination of investment opinions or investment research using social media. Now, if you are not aware of these laws that have been passed, then you are in violation of Standard 1A. So this is point number one, that you need to know the law. If you say that you do not know the law or you are not aware, that is not a valid excuse. The second point is that if there is a conflict between the law and what is stated in the code and standards, then you must follow the more strict interpretation. That's this point over here. And then the third is that you must not knowingly participate or assist in, and you must disassociate from any violation of such laws, rules, or regulations. All right, now what I will do is take the guidance segment in the curriculum and highlight the most important points. The first one has to do with the relationship between the code and standards. So this is the CFA Institute Code and Standards and the applicable law. To understand this point, let's say that you are an investment advisor and you live in Malaysia. You are a Malaysian citizen and your clients are also based in Malaysia. So clearly, the laws of Malaysia related to investments and investment advice and investment research will apply to you. That then is the applicable law for you as someone operating in Malaysia. Given that you have also signed up for the CFA exam, you are now a candidate. So the code and standards also apply to you. The relationship between the code and standards and the applicable law is that whenever there is an area where there is a conflict between the applicable law and the code and standards, then you need to go with the stricter interpretation. Now, I'm not saying that this is the case, but let's say that the laws in Malaysia are extremely strict in terms of portfolio managers and investment advisors participating in IPOs. If the law in Malaysia says that investment advisors should not be participating in IPOs, whereas the code and standards does allow participation in IPOs given certain circumstances, then the stricter interpretation must be taken. In other words, you need to follow the applicable law. There might be other situations where something in the code and standards is stricter than the applicable law. In that scenario, you need to follow the code and standards. The next point has to do with investment products and applicable laws. Here, if you have the curriculum in front of you, I would refer you to Exhibit 1, which presents several scenarios. You might be a US citizen working in a different country, and let's say that you are selling your investment services and investment products in that particular region. So say you are currently based in Central Asia and you are selling investment services and products to various countries in Central Asia, but you are a US citizen and you also are pursuing the CFA charter, so the code and standards apply to you. Now, the question becomes, as a US citizen, do you follow the US law? Do you follow the law of the country where you are currently residing? Do you follow the laws of the country where you are selling your products and services? Do you follow the code and standards? So all this is explained in Exhibit 1. The simple high-level summary is that when in doubt, follow the strictest interpretation. But let us consider different scenarios. And the way Exhibit 1 is structured, and I'll just summarize this for you, we might have three kinds of countries. NS, which refers to a country with no securities laws or regulations. LS, where the securities related laws and regulations are less strict compared to the code and standards. And then MS, where the law is more strict than the code and standards. So I'll just go through some of the scenarios. Let's say you reside in NS. So this country has no standards when it comes to investment related work, but you do business in a country that is LS. In other words, this country where you do business has securities related laws, but those laws are less strict compared to the code and standards. So in this case, the applicable law for you, given that you are selling services in LS, the applicable law is LS. But what should you follow? You need to follow the higher standard or the most strict standard, which is what you get through the code and standards. Because when the code and standards is more strict than the applicable law, then you need to follow the CFA Institute code and standards. Another scenario is where you reside in NS, do business in MS or the country with laws that are more strict than the code and standards. Then what do you do? Then again, along the lines of following the most strict interpretation, you need to follow MS. We now come to the final part of 1A, which is that you must not knowingly participate or assist in, and you must disassociate from any violation of such laws, rules, or regulations. It is important to understand this term knowingly. Knowingly means something that you know or that you should know. Going deeper into this point, let's say that you suspect that a violation is taking place. Say you are in a supervisory position and someone who reports to you might have done something wrong. You are not sure, you just have a suspicion. Then the first thing that you can do is just ask. So in this case, you try to determine by speaking to the person concerned as to whether he or she has violated the standard in any way. But obviously, this might not always be possible. There might be situations where your colleagues or your supervisor might be doing something wrong, and it might also be the case that you are not sure whether a violation is taking place or not. If that is the scenario, or if that is the case, then it is perfectly acceptable to seek the advice of your firm's compliance department or legal counsel. In fact, over the years, I have seen several questions where the appropriate action is to go seek legal counsel. Let's now move to a situation where you have observed something wrong happening and you are convinced that it is a violation of the code and standards. So what do? The first thing is to try and stop the behavior. And obviously, if you are in a supervisory role, that might be possible. But if you are not, then you take the matter to your compliance department. So have a meeting with the appropriate person in the compliance department and inform them of what you have seen. So I'll just write that down as the compliance department. If necessary, you can seek independent legal counsel. Let's say that you speak to the compliance department and you do not get a satisfactory answer, and you suspect that maybe the compliance department either is too weak or is potentially involved. So what do? Then, according to the code and standards, the appropriate action is to seek independent legal counsel. And finally, if nothing happens and the activity that is clearly a violation of the code and standards continues to happen, then you should disassociate yourself from that activity. The next question becomes, what exactly does disassociation mean? The disassociation practices will differ on the basis of your role in the investment industry or your role in the organization. And disassociation may involve removing your name from written reports and recommendations. Disassociation may involve asking for a different assignment or refusing to accept a new client. If you feel that some activity is taking place with a current client that you are not comfortable with, then you can request that you be removed from that particular client. The extreme case of disassociation is where you resign from the organization. If you feel that something unethical or a violation of the code and standards is happening around you and you don't do anything, or let's say you just report to the legal department, the compliance department, and then just continue thinking that I have informed the relevant personnel, then that actually is considered illegal or unethical. If you do realize that a violation of the code and standards is taking place and you don't do much, so your inaction combined with continuing association with those involved in illegal or unethical conduct can be construed as participation or assistance in the illegal or unethical conduct. So far in the discussion, I have talked about reporting potential violations to the compliance department or the legal department and potentially seeking independent legal counsel. But the question is whether you as a candidate should report violations to CFA Institute. The answer is that CFA Institute encourages you to report violations, although the code and standards do not compel you or require you to do so. Also, the CFA Institute does not require that you report violations to the government or the regulatory authority unless mandatory under applicable law. In a sense, what CFA Institute is doing is leaving the judgment up to you. So if you feel it is appropriate to report to the law enforcement authority, then you can do so. But if you don't, that is not a violation of the code and standards. Now we come to the recommended procedures for compliance related to Standard 1A. Here we will talk about what it is that you should be doing. The first one obviously is stay informed. So you need to be aware of any new laws and regulations. In fact, you should establish and encourage your employer to establish a procedure by which all employees in your firm are regularly informed about changes in the applicable laws, rules, and regulations. Next point is review procedures. You should review the procedures of your company. These are the compliance related procedures. And you should also encourage your employer to review the firm's written compliance procedures on a regular basis in order to ensure that the procedures reflect the current law and provide adequate guidance to employees about what is allowed under the law and or the code and standards. Maintain current files. You should maintain or encourage your employer to maintain readily accessible current reference copies of the applicable laws and regulations. Legal counsel, and this is important. When you are in doubt about the appropriate action to take, it is recommended that you seek advice of the compliance team or the compliance person in your organization, or if the matter has legal implications, then speak to the legal counsel. Another scenario is where you believe that somebody else in the firm is violating the law or violating the code and standards. So here again, it makes sense to speak to the compliance department or the legal counsel. Disassociation. When disassociating from an activity that violates the code and standards, what you should do ideally is document the violation and urge your company or your firm to attempt to persuade the person who is committing the violation to stop doing so. The final set of points here relate specifically to what you should be advising and encouraging your firm to do. One point is that if a firm doesn't already have a code of ethics, then you should encourage your firm to do so. And if your firm is an investment management firm, then it can potentially adopt the research objectivity standards. What the firm might also do is force all the employees to follow the CFA Institute code and standards and so on. As discussed before, you should also encourage the firm to provide information on applicable laws and make sure that this information is easily available and disseminated through regular training courses and educational seminars. You should encourage your firm to establish procedures for reporting violations. In other words, it should be easy for an employee to report violations, because that in of itself becomes a deterrent for others to commit violations. What I now want you to do is open the curriculum and go through the application of standards. You will find several examples there, and read each example or scenario, think about the appropriate course of action and whether the standard has been violated or not, and then read the comment. You will notice eventually that on questions that you see at the end of this reading and then questions in mock exams and your actual exam, many of them are likely to be closely related to the examples and scenarios in this particular reading. We now come to Standard 1B, Independence and Objectivity. Members and candidates must use reasonable care and judgment to achieve and maintain independence and objectivity in their professional activities. Members and candidates must not offer, solicit, or accept any gift, benefit, compensation, or consideration that reasonably could be expected to compromise their own or another's independence and objectivity. This is extremely important, and the concept of independence and objectivity keeps showing up in other standards also. There is really one core point being made in this standard, which is that we as investment advisors need to be independent and objective. And then the second sentence is just saying that anything such as a gift or a benefit or additional compensation that compromises independence and objectivity should basically not be allowed or should be discouraged. Before going further, let's understand the importance of this standard. Let's say that you write research reports on a few companies, And there is a perception that you receive expensive gifts from these companies and then write very favorable reports. So there is the perception that your independence and objectivity is compromised because of the gifts that you receive. Does that hurt your professional integrity? Obviously it does. People who believe that you are receiving gifts and then writing good reports are not likely to trust your reports. Not only does this hurt your professional integrity, it also hurts the integrity of your firm, and it also impacts the industry that you operate in. So when one person in an industry is operating unethically or is perceived to not be independent and objective, that potentially hurts the overall industry. You can see that this is an extremely important standard and needs to be understood well. This standard also indicates how independence and objectivity can be impacted. And that's shown right here. It could be through gifts, benefits, compensation, and so on. As you might imagine, in the investment analysis industry or the investment management industry, there will be several external forces which try to influence the process by offering analysts and portfolio managers various benefits such as those shown over here. Let's now look at the guidance, and here we will look at the different situations and circumstances where potentially independence and objectivity might be compromised. To help you understand this well, let's just create a scenario. Say you work in the research department of a large brokerage firm, and say that this brokerage firm also has an investment banking department, but you are here in the research department and you are writing reports on large pharmaceutical companies. So you evaluate the companies and then you make recommendations as to whether investors should buy the stock or hold on to the stock or potentially sell the stock. Now, or who might try to impact or have an influence on the reports that you write? One is buy-side clients. And let me just make a clarification here. When you work at a brokerage firm and you are creating reports and then disseminating those reports to a wide audience, you are referred to as a sell-side analyst because you are selling your services to other entities. One entity that will use your reports is buy-side clients. So an example of a buy-side client would be a large mutual fund. So mutual funds obviously have large holdings. Say there is a particular mutual fund that focuses on pharmaceutical companies, and say that this particular mutual fund has a large holding of Pfizer stock. Pfizer is a major pharmaceutical company. Now, obviously, this particular buy-side client, the mutual fund, would not be too happy if you publish a report with a negative view on Pfizer stock. So potentially they might try to influence you to write favorable reports. Another scenario is investment banking relationships. Now, taking this example further, I already mentioned that your firm also has this investment banking department, and say the investment banking department is trying to work with Pfizer to do a secondary offering. So this department is working with Pfizer to raise more funds, and for this particular service, or if the investment banking department wins this deal or this project with Pfizer, they will make a lot of money. Now, what the investment banking department might try to do is influence you to write positive reports on Pfizer. But again, that is not something that you should do. Your reports should be totally independent and objective. Another influence might come directly from the public companies. So Pfizer, for example, might directly try to influence you through gifts or through other potential benefits and encourage you to write favorable reports. Next, we come to issuer paid research. Let's say there is a company that is not widely followed, and this company approaches you to write a research report, and you are being paid to write this particular research report. Clearly, there will be potential conflicts of interest over here, and obviously the company would want you to write a favorable report. Travel funding. Let us say that this company that wants you to write a research report then asks you to visit its headquarters and visit its facilities across Europe, and your entire travel is funded by this particular company. Again, that introduces several potential conflicts of interest. Credit rating agency options. We change gears a little bit here, and let's say that there is a friend of yours. So this is your friend. He works at a credit rating agency. You write reports on pharmaceutical company stocks, and let's say that this friend of yours issues credit ratings to bonds that are issued by pharmaceutical companies. Now, just the way you can be influenced, or there is a potential for external entities influencing you, similarly, there is the potential of external entities influencing your friend. Your friend is issuing reports or essentially giving a grade to the various bonds, and the issuer, the companies which are issuing the bonds, would want favorable reports and might try to influence your friend. Influence during the manager selection procurement process. Now, here there is another scenario. So let's say you have another friend who works at an asset management company. So this particular friend is a portfolio manager, and this entity, the asset management company where your friend is a portfolio manager, is approached by a large pension fund. This pension fund has substantial amounts of money and wants an asset manager to look after its plan assets. Now, there are potential issues on both sides here. Multiple asset management companies will be vying for this business, and there might be gifts exchanged which unduly influence the process. So one possible scenario is you have asset management company 1, which is where your friend works, and then company 2, company 3, and company 2 tries to influence the process by giving substantial gifts to the manager over here who is responsible for making the decision. So clearly in this scenario, there are potential influences from external entities. Brokerage houses. Now, coming back to the asset management company and the portfolio manager, this portfolio manager is obviously managing funds, and when he wants to have trades executed, he needs to go through a brokerage company. There might be several different brokerage companies that would obviously vie for this business, because brokerage companies make money by executing trades, and different brokerage companies obviously would want to get the business from the asset management company. And therefore, there might be expensive gifts that they might try to give to portfolio managers in order to influence and encourage the portfolio managers to do business with them. We've talked about how external influences might impact the independence and objectivity of an investment manager or a portfolio manager. Now let's discuss the recommended procedures for compliance. And if these procedures are put in place, then that will help ensure the independence and objectivity of the investment management process. The first item has to do with protecting the integrity of opinions. If you have a supervisory position at a firm, you should try and establish policies such that every research report is unbiased and in fact reflects the unbiased opinion of the analyst. You should also encourage your firm to design compensation systems that protect the integrity of the investment decision process by maintaining the independence and objectivity of analysts. If you are a junior analyst and do not have much influence in the organization, then you need to develop your own procedure in order to ensure the independence and objectivity of your work. Next, create a restricted list. Now, this goes back to a discussion we had earlier about a brokerage firm, and I said that you are a research analyst here at the firm. Let's also say that two of the pharmaceutical companies that you are following also happen to be firms that are being approached by the investment banking group within your firm. One of the steps that your organization can take is to put those two firms on a restricted list. And that means that you will not be writing or presenting your opinions related to these two firms. You will simply be publishing reports with facts about these particular companies on the restricted list. And this helps avoid the potential conflict that we discussed earlier under investment banking relationships. Restrict special cost arrangements. Earlier we talked about issuer paid research and travel funding. And we said that there might be a situation where you are doing research on a particular company in order to come up with a report. And that company might pay for your travel expenses and perhaps have you transported on a corporate jet, make you stay in lavish hotels and so on, which clearly would impact your independence and objectivity. Or at least there is a possibility that your independence and objectivity might be compromised. To avoid that situation, there should be some special cost arrangements. And what this means is that ideally your company should pay for your travel expenses. If the situation is such that there are no public hotels in the area where you are visiting, then it is all right for you to stay in the facilities provided by the company, as long as the facilities are not too lavish. And also, if there is no public transport available to the location where you need to travel to, then it is okay to accept a chartered flight offered by this particular organization that you are researching. So we need to be practical. Key point is to avoid anything that might potentially impact your independence and objectivity. Next item is extremely important: limit gifts, and this keeps coming up in questions. Note that this doesn't say that all gifts are wrong or that all gifts will impact independence and objectivity. We need to be careful about determining which gifts might impact independence and objectivity and which might not. In all the examples I talked about here, where an external influence is trying to impact your independence and objectivity. For example, you are writing the research report and a buy-side client, somebody at a large mutual fund, is trying to influence you. Or if a public company is trying to influence you, then getting gifts from that entity would clearly be problematic. However, token gifts, small gifts, such as a company sending a calendar, that is okay. On the other hand, if you are working at an asset management company and your client is extremely happy with your performance and decides to give you some compensation, then as long as you keep your employer informed, those gifts potentially do not create any conflict of interest and they might be okay. But again, you need to make sure that your employer is aware of the gifts that you are getting. When you receive a gift from a client and disclose it to your employer, the employer can then make an independent judgment about whether that gift is impacting your independence and objectivity. Going back to receiving gifts from one of these entities, the recommended procedure is to establish strict limits based on local customs. For example, in some countries, the gift limit might be that anything under $25 is acceptable, but gifts over this value should not be accepted. This would mean that simple gifts like calendars and so on would be alright, because one would not expect a calendar to influence the independence and objectivity of a research analyst. The next point is restrict investments. Here you need to encourage your firm to develop formal policies related to employees purchasing equity or equity related IPOs. Just to understand what's going on here, say you are writing a research report on a particular company and you know that you are going to issue a strong buy recommendation. Before issuing that recommendation, you purchase shares in that particular company because you expect the stock price to go up after your research report is published. Clearly, that would be problematic, and the company should have policies against such procedures. IPOs keep showing up on the CFA exam, and you need to be clear about this. Very often, firms help their clients with IPOs, and you might hear the term a hot IPO or an oversubscribed IPO. This is where the IPO is extremely popular, there's lots of interest, and generally the expectation is that after the IPO, the stock price will go up. So if people in your organization are involved in this process and they participate in the IPO in terms of buying shares for themselves, then potential conflicts of interest can creep in, and the independence and objectivity of their research reports can potentially be compromised. Next item, review procedures. You should encourage your firm to implement effective supervisory and review procedures to ensure that the analysts and portfolio managers in your company comply with policies related to their personal investing activities. Notice that CFA Institute does not put down hard and fast rules. The judgment generally is left to the organizations concerned to put in place the correct policies and procedures so that independence and objectivity is not compromised. Independence policy. You should encourage your firm to establish a formal written policy on the independence and objectivity of research and implement reporting structures and review procedures to ensure that research analysts do not report to and are not supervised or controlled by any department of the firm that could compromise the independence of the analyst. Appointed officer. Ideally, firms should appoint a senior officer with oversight responsibilities for compliance with the firm's code of ethics and all regulations concerning its business. Firms should also provide every employee with the procedures and policies for reporting potentially unethical behavior, violations of regulations, or other activities that may harm the firm's reputation. So those are the main points related to independence and objectivity. I have essentially followed the sequence in the curriculum and in several places quoted from the curriculum. Your job now is to do the various examples. So read the examples, think about the appropriate course of action, and then read the comments.